Hello and welcome to episode 7 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to our special guest this week, Ross Clarke, Spectator columnist and author of Not Zero, on why Ed Miliband's crusade against oil and gas could put Britain's economy 6 feet under.
In short, Labour's 2030 target is a very large pie in the sky.
Take a look at what happened.
Tony Morrison, who writes on US politics for the Daily Sceptic, on the shocking assassination attempt against President Trump and what it means for America.
Regular folks are outraged, I can tell you that right now.
Dr. Carole Sherwood, founder of Save Mental Health, on the trans-activist psychotherapists refusing to accept the findings of the Cass Review.
In terms of the medical establishment, seems to be going well, but in terms of the professional therapeutic organisations, we have a problem.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with Dr. Gary Sidley, co-founder of the Smile Free campaign on the technocratic tyranny of nudge.
The use of these approaches has accelerated and they've now woven their way into pretty much every aspect of our kind of lives.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, Ed Miliband is perhaps best known for sinking his party's fortunes at the 2015 election as Labour leader with his infamous Ed Stone.
These 6 pledges are now carved in stone. They're carved
But 9 years later, he's reinvented himself as a green zealot, and he's back in government, leading the oxymoronically named Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So, will this spell the end for Britain's economy? Well, to find out, I'm pleased to be joined first by our special guest this week, Ross Clarke, Spectator columnist and leader writer and the author of Not Zero, How an Irrational Target Will Impoverish You, Help China, and Won't Even Save the Planet. Welcome to The Sceptic, Ross.
Welcome, hello.
Okay, so the big story here is Ed Miliband's plans for licences for North Sea oil and gas. What's been going on?
Sure, well, the Labour sort of promised that it would honour existing licences for oil and gas extraction in the North Sea, but it wouldn't issue any new ones. The previous government, Rishi Sunak's government, took a different line, so we will issue new oil and gas licences. Now, there are some applications on the back of Rishi Sunak's initiative that are sort of in the means, in the process of being considered, in the process of being granted. And there was a report in the Daily Telegraph that Ed Miliband had sort of decided he's going to block them all, and the oil and gas companies which had spent millions of pounds preparing these bids and so on would be sort of just frozen out. Now, the Department of Energy and Net Zero says that's not quite right. No decision has yet been made on these applications, but it seems at least possible that they might be blocked, and certainly after these rounds, there would be no more, according to Labour policy.
Indeed. And obviously it's been long-standing Labour policy not to renew oil and gas licences. But with this round already up in the air, even if they do eventually go through, it's not going to be great news for the oil and gas industry more widely, is it?
Well, I think you've got to put yourself in the shoes of a chief executive of an oil and gas company just at the moment, deciding whether to invest in the North Sea. Well, you just look at the political mood music with the new government and you're probably going to say, I don't want to take any risk in the North Sea. Labour say they will honour our existing licences, but will they? Or will they try and force us out? They're already being threatened with windfall taxes, extra windfall taxes. Well, you're probably not going to choose to invest in Britain unless you're really confident that you've got a field which is going to be profitable in the longer term. So it's going to accelerate the demise of the North Sea oil and gas industry, essentially. It's true to say that this is an industry which has been in decline many years anyway. It peaked in about 2003. So it's been in decline for 20 years, a natural decline as the reserves are worked out. But certainly the arrival of the Labour government is going to hasten its end, which could be a big problem for Labour, because in their manifesto they counted £1.2 billion extra government revenue was going to come from windfall taxes, enhanced windfall taxes on top of the ones we've already got on oil and gas companies. Well, if oil and gas companies decide to withdraw from the North Sea, well, they're not going to get those revenues, are they? Not just not going to get the extra revenues, they're not going to get the revenues they're already getting. So, it could plunge the government into a bit of a fiscal crisis if it's forces out North Sea to extinction before it does. I mean, last year was about £9 billion revenue came from North Sea, which is about 1% of government revenue, but it's a pretty chunky amount of money.
Indeed. And so in terms of Britain's energy security more widely, how worried should we be about having an energy secretary who is essentially ideologically opposed to oil and gas?
Yes, I do. I'm going to go back to the decline of the North Sea I was talking about. I mean, until the first few years of this century, Britain was, energy secure, energy self-sufficient, and it had been since sort of 1970s, thanks to the North Sea. So we are, year on year, going to have to rely more on imported oil and gas. But, if you speed up the demise of the North Sea, well, that doesn't help things. And Ed Miliband's answer to this is he always says, all this oil and gas comes out the North Sea. Well, it's all going to be sold on global markets. There's no benefit to us anyway. Well, it's not true, really, is it? You just got to ask yourself, why are gas prices and, domestic gas prices and petrol prices so much cheaper in the US than they are here? Well, partly because of taxation, of course, in case of road traffic. But it's because the US has unashamedly pursued a policy of energy security for the past 2 decades. Now, if we choose not to produce oil and gas from the North Sea, that means we become more reliant. And what's happening now, because we were importing a lot of gas from sort of European pipelines, and when after the invasion of Ukraine, the supply from Russia that was feeding that network was cut off, we were suddenly, and the rest of Europe, suddenly in this huge problem. And what's happened in the past couple of years is we have started importing far more liquefied natural gas by ship from the US and from Qatar mostly. But it's expensive to do that, and it would be much cheaper if we had native oil. I mean, the process to liquefy natural gas and then regasify it when you get to Britain, that consumes about 10% of the energy in the gas to start with. So there's a huge loss of efficiency. So for every, kilowatt hours worth of gas that we import, it's more expensive and it involves more carbon emissions than gas we could produce in the North Sea. So, if you want to close down the North Sea early, on the pretext that it's not really going to reduce global carbon emissions, I'm afraid. It's going to increase them, because it means that we're going to be importing more of this sort of less efficient liquefied natural gas.
Yes, and of course another justification that's used by Miliband and others for the so-called green transition is to not be reliant on the oil and gas of dictatorial regimes around the world. And yet here we're having to buy gas from Qatar, which is, hardly a Western liberal democracy. So isn't that counterproductive?
Yeah, if you want to reduce your dependence on dictatorships for your oil and gas, then what you want is as much oil and gas as possibly can be to be produced in Western democracies. And I mean, it's thanks to the US really pursuing its policy of energy security that we have, we're not more exposed to Russian gas and oil, and we're not more exposed to OPEC. But the OPEC has lost its power in recent years because of the US has stepped up production. So what Ed Miliband is saying is complete nonsense. The idea that if we stop producing oil and gas, we're suddenly going to be less dependent on dictatorships. I mean, even those who advocate net zero by 2050 accept that oil and gas is going to be an important part of our energy mix for the next 30 years and quite possibly beyond that. We combine with carbon capture and storage and so on. So there's nothing you can say to North Sea company, well, you can't produce oil and gas here, but that does nothing on itself to reduce demand for oil and gas in Britain, which is going to continue. So it just puts Britain in a slightly worse situation than we would be otherwise if we are producing oil and gas.
So Labour has billed itself as this sort of safe pair of hands government that's going to grow the economy, and yet it's got an energy secretary who wants to zealously push ahead with net zero. Isn't this going to be a big thorn in their side?
Yeah, what's the really big problem Labour are going to have is this 2030 target for decarbonising the national grid, our electricity supply. At the moment, our electricity mix is about 40% gas. It's about sort of 35% solar and wind, and about 15% nuclear, and there's a bit. The rest we either import or as a little bit from hydroelectric and so on. But to move to a grid which is essentially 100% zero carbon, which Labour wants to do, well, you basically got to either kick out that 40% that is gas, or you've got to hook up those gas stations to carbon capture and storage to make them carbon neutral, physically remove the carbon dioxide from their chimneys and bury it underground so they're not actually emitting carbon dioxide. No, Labour has slightly changed its tune on this. It now seems it is prepared to consider carbon capture and storage, whereas before it was only prepared to seem to consider solar and wind. But we don't yet have a full-scale commercial working carbon capture and storage plant. The technology is, it exists. It's been in existence for the past 50 years. It was invented, ironically, by the oil and gas industry to pump the stuff underground to force out more oil and gas from depleted fields. So, technology exists, but as a means of decarbonising gas power plants, it doesn't yet really exist as a fully proven commercial technology. And if it can be made to exist, well, 5 years is quite a short time to do that, and it's going to be very expensive. Now, look on the other side, what else could we do? Nuclear energy. Well, nuclear energy exists. We could have much more nuclear in our mix, but not by 2030. We're not. By 2030, we're going to be in a worse position than we are now because Hinkley Point, in Somerset, probably still won't be quite open by then. But 4 out of 5 of our existing nuclear power stations are due to close by then. They can possibly be extended, but they are reaching the end of their lives. There is no way that Labour is going to be able to achieve a sort of nuclear revolution within 5 years. So that leaves renewables. And yeah, you can build lots of wind turbines and solar farms and so on, but you're left with a very, very big problem because these are intermittent sources of energy. You get to a still winter evening and they will produce virtually nothing. Solar will produce nothing, and there'll be very, very little wind power going into the system. At the moment, we already have enough wind and solar farms theoretically to provide us with the average UK electricity demand. But on a still winter evening, the output can fall to less than 1% of our energy demand. So this is vast gulf you have to fill somehow, either with some kind of backup. We use gas at the moment. If we can't use gas, then what do we use? We can, what about battery installations? Well, we have a few of them, but ones we have at the moment won't even store an hour's worth of electricity use. And the cost of storing energy in batteries will be about 5-6 times as much per kilowatt hour as it costs to generate the electricity from wind or gas in the first place. So that gives you an idea of the incredible cost burden that would come from you relying on energy storage. There are other ways we theoretically do it. Pumped storage systems, we already have some of those, 2-level reservoirs. You pump the water up the hill when its energy is plentiful and let it run down the hill through the turbines when you need the energy. They work. Again, there's a big loss of efficiency. You only get about 70% of the energy out that you put in. Again, very expensive. There are other things which are being considered, like compressed air. When you've got lots of energy, you pump air into an underground cavern, and then when you need the energy, you decompress it, let it flow out. And there's also hydrogen, the possibility. Could we, on sunny and windy days, manufacture hydrogen through electrolysis of water, then store that and then burn it on days when we need the energy? Well, yeah, it's another possibility, but it's going to be extremely expensive. And it's certainly not going to be in commercial form by 2030 because, the problems scaling up the electrolysis of water to produce hydrogen. That technology is not coming on quite as quickly as people had hoped. So, in short, Labour's 2030 target is a very large pie in the sky, and the unions have said it. The GMB union, which represents a lot of engineering workers, Jim Ratcliffe, who now theoretically supporting the Labour Party, who owns the INEOS and the Grangemouth oil refinery, he said it just can't be done. And yet Ed Miliband seems to be ploughing ahead with this target. Well, either at some point he's going to have to drop it, or he's going to have to fail, or he's going to have to sort of impose massive energy price rises on the public in trying to, speed up these half-baked technologies a bit too fast than they really can go. So, it's a very, very big problem for Labour having committed to this, and not only having committed to it, but by swearing it's going to cut our energy bills. We're all going to save 300 quid a year, according to Ed Miliband, as we switch to renewable energy. Well, no, basically, because look at a country like Denmark. Denmark's 57% of its electricity last year came from wind. That's sort of twice as much as in Britain. It's a trendsetter in the world in terms of wind energy. And what else is remarkable about wind at Denmark? It has the highest domestic electricity prices in the world. So that gives you an idea. Wind power might be cheap when you look at it in marginal costs, but when you look at the overall cost and the costs of backup and so on, it becomes a very, very different story.
Okay, Ross Clark, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you.
Now, we all saw the shocking scenes that took place in Pennsylvania last Saturday. Donald Trump was speaking at an outdoor campaign rally when shots rang out. Trump was hit in the ear, drawing blood, before being bundled to the ground and away to hospital. Other shots went into the crowd, tragically killing one and injuring others. The The gunman, on a roof some 150 yards away, was killed by Secret Service snipers. Some details are yet to emerge, but what's clear is that Trump was lucky to escape with his life. Had the former president not turned his head at the last second, he would in all likelihood have been struck by the bullet not in the ear, but the head. To discuss what this barbarous assault means for America, I'm pleased to be joined now from Connecticut by Tony Morrison, who writes on US politics for the Daily Sceptic. Welcome to The Sceptic, Tony.
Thank you very much, Laurie.
Okay, so clearly this was a deeply, deeply shocking incident. Why don't you just start by taking us through what happened?
Sure. I think I actually was watching TV, and it's weird because it looked like Trump was hit with something trivial, and the shots were so far away, it sounded like a sort of a BB gun. But then it became pretty obvious when there was blood all over his face that something serious was happening. The Secret Service jumped on him immediately, like they do, and he was hustled off, but not before managing to come up with one of the most iconic photographs. It'll be added to the list, Iwo Jima, flag on the moon, all the American iconic photos, and that's what got me about it, because when you've been shot and you've actually been hurt, and the Secret Service throw you to the ground. And when he got back up, he raised his fist and yelled, "Fight, fight, fight." And there was Old Glory, the American flag behind him. And that's an iconic, that will be. But the thing that got me was the fact that this was a guy who, in a moment of crisis, came through. He was courageous, and he met the moment. And I think that alone, that photo alone, is going to put him over the finish line in November, because he looked like a president. That's what we want our presidents to be, courageous, and crisis comes, he's there and he meets it. Now, I'm not a big fan of Trump, by the way, because of character and things, but to me, that was pretty amazing, and I think it's going to sink in gradually over the next couple of months, how wonderful that is. And compare it to the other iconic photo we have right now, which is our president at the debate, Biden, where he stares gormlessly into space. So you've got two photos side by side. America, like other countries, is very much taken by images these days. And there it is, right in front of you. You don't have to say anything else. And you've noticed that Trump hasn't said much since then, because he doesn't have to, In fact, he's come up with a weird thing where now he seems to be very statesmanlike, which is very unusual for Trump, who's usually a more casual, kind of guy, shall we say. So that's what got me.
So one thing to note is that at his recent debate with Biden, he tried to be a bit more statesmanlike. And he said now, following the shooting in an interview, that he's going to change his forthcoming speech to the Republican National Convention to make it a bit more conciliatory and unifying.
Right.
So how do you think this is going to affect his campaign more widely?
It would be good to see him look statesmanlike, which is something that's sometimes is missing in the past, put it that way. However, I take exception to why he has to do that, in the sense that immediately after the assassination attempt, here comes everybody, media, politicians, Democrat politicians, they all come out and say, look, we have to turn down the temperature. In fact, Trump was criticized, half an hour after the shooting for not coming on and saying, we need to turn down the temperature. I mean, how dare these people, because for the last 8 years, they've been going on and on and on about how everybody to the right of Che Guevara, because the Democrat Party has moved left, as you probably understand, are Nazis, white supremacists, racists, a whole bunch of insults among half the population of the United States. And then these people, like Biden, when he became president, he had the gall to say, I'm going to be the president of unity, after his party had done all this. And it got worse during the last 4 years. The Democrats in Congress had a 2-year investigation into that January the 6th stuff, pretending that it was an armed insurrection instead of a protest. And they've been at him ever since. And the last year, they turned it up. They turned the temperature up themselves by going on about getting cases against him in court that are stupid. A whole bunch of stuff. And then for them to come on and say, okay, we both need to turn down the temperature, as if both sides are responsible for that. They're not. One side is. And one side has to clean up their act. And it's got to the point now, and I'm not saying Trump's assassination was part of that, because I don't believe but when somebody comes on and says, again and again and again, that we have to unite when they're the people who have done the damage over the last 8 years, I take great exception to that. And Trump's doing the right political thing, right? He's going to serve that. But for regular people, regular folks are outraged. I can tell you that right now. They've been outraged for quite a while for various reasons. And this is probably the most important of them.
So you live in Connecticut, which is actually fairly close to Pennsylvania. What's the sentiment like on the ground there? How are people reacting to this?
Well, I'll start first with how people didn't react, okay? It's like, the Sherlock Holmes story about the dog in the nighttime. Sherlock Holmes says the salient point about this case is what the dog did in the nighttime. Watson says, but the dog did nothing in the nighttime. And Holmes says, exactly. And that's what I thought, in the last couple of days. Republicans or followers of Trump, whatever, whoever is not a Democrat, were accused of this January the 6th thing, where there was a protest, people entered the Capitol, they walked around, they trespassed, they did damage to buildings, and that was about it. Nobody carried a gun, except the cop who shot one of the protesters. And, it was a bad thing, shouldn't have happened. But it wasn't a marauding set of people, trashing everything. And you sort of, you look at that and you think, okay, well, for the last 4 years, they've characterized any follower of Trump, who's not a Democrat, as that. Okay, these are the people we're protecting you against. Okay, now, when the leader of the Republican Party is attempted to be assassinated, you would have thought that you would have millions of people, surging to Washington, all armed to the teeth, because 50% of America is armed in the sense of they own guns. And, there'd be massive insurrection. It's the one thing that didn't happen, okay? Because it was all a lie from start to finish, okay? And how people reacted was a sense of outrage. And it's kind of like seething outrage that's under the skin. It's not going to manifest itself in anything like, we're not driven by emotion, like, say, Black Lives Matter or any of that nonsense. But people are driven because they want to keep, their society as is. And they're seething because of it. They're really, really upset. And it's going to show itself at the ballot box. Or as President Biden said, a few hours ago, he called them the battle boxes, but that's Biden for you.
Right. So people are very angry that this happened. People are also angry that this has been allowed to happen, and there's been a lot of criticism, especially of the Secret Service, who has seemed not to have done a very good job here. What do you make of what went wrong?
Yeah, I'll preface my comments by saying we don't know. There's no investigation being done, obviously. All we know right now is the person who did it seems to be a very young guy, a loner, obviously is disturbed in some respect. And that's all we know. I don't think he's attached to any political movement or, has got a motive for that. But the investigation hasn't been done. Now, the Secret Service, okay, one of your main jobs is to protect the president. If you allow somebody to come within a millimeter of killing the president, right, despite the massive budget you've got and the people, then you are, that's on you. That's your fault. And we have to find out why that was allowed to happen. And I believe, and this is, again, preface it by saying no investigation, I believe it was incompetence. Never underestimate incompetence on behalf of a federal agency in this country. And that's because it's got worse and worse over the last few years. we've had a long march to our institutions where we seem to have essentially ruined them. To give you another example, the military. Nobody wants to sign up to fight anymore. There were thousands of troops down last year on their recruitment. And in serious areas too, the majority of troops are white people, because the majority of people in this country are white. But those are the people who aren't signing up. Blacks, Hispanics, everybody's signing up in the same numbers, but whites aren't, and they're gradually, moving away from these things because they've been told over and over again, that the whole agenda that's against, because you want to get diversity, you want to get more people in, and what the Democrats do is they, instead of saying we'll make it as easy as possible for others to sign up, they've essentially, put us into divisions. You have to take something away from them in order to get X. Okay, what happens when you don't get X and you've taken things away? So the Secret Service is doing something like that in the sense. I know they have a DEI initiative because every agency in the federal government has one. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's too much attached to that. The incompetence. But because what you saw there was the fact that those people didn't seem trained, right? They didn't cover Trump completely. They didn't hustle him out within 2 seconds. I was around during the attempted Reagan assassination. Reagan was gone within a millisecond. After people threw their bodies in front, he was gone. He was out in the car and he was on his way to hospital. You didn't see that here. You didn't see that sense of urgency. You saw lots of people running around like chickens with their head cut off. You didn't see people saying, this is my job, I'm protecting the president with my life, and he's gone, right? Secondly, if you look at any part of the geography of that assassination, you'll notice that the guy who had the rifle, took the 6 shots, was on a roof 100 yards away, 100 yards away, which had no law enforcement on it. It didn't have the Secret Service on it. It didn't have the local police on it. The sniper obviously took him out as soon as he opened fire, but he shouldn't have been there in the first place. He shouldn't have got there, and that's a failing, okay? You've got 2 serious failings there, and what's going to happen is they'll try and cover it up. Mayorkas is the Department of Homeland Security chief, where the Secret Service resides. He's one of Biden's favorite dudes because he's opened up the border to get 12 million people in who have no business being here. And, so you can't sacrifice him, right? Even though if it had been me, I'd have resigned the next day. But that's another story. So they have a go at the woman who has been in charge of the Secret Service for the last 2 years. And she's been implementing diversity policy. I'm sure people, have a go at that and say, is this part of, what happened? Not necessarily so, I don't think. I just think it's people being incompetent. And she should have resigned the day after as the person in charge of the Secret Service. I think what they'll do is they'll probably make her the scapegoat, and on we go from there. But you don't need a scapegoat at this point. You need to go through the Secret Service root and branch and determine, what on earth is going on there? Why is the training lax? One last point about the Secret Service is it's been politicized in the sense that the people working as Biden have essentially decided in this election campaign that they will only award Secret Service protection. They'll be as frugal as they possibly can with people who aren't Biden, because they understand that causes problems with the other candidates. So, for instance, one of those other candidates is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And Robert Kennedy Jr.'s dad was shot and killed when there wasn't Secret Service. In fact, the reason there is this Secret Service protection is because of his dad. And, he's got the name, the crazies come out, when you hear Kennedy. And they have not given him Secret Service protection, even though I'd be the first person to do so, bearing in mind the name and all the other stuff. He didn't get it as a Democrat contender against Biden, and he didn't get it when he declared as an independent. Okay, because they want him to go away. He'll take votes from Biden. Now, in terms of Trump did get it. However, as you can see from just the footage, he didn't get the A team. Okay, and apparently, according to reports, his regular team was off because they were so worked. They needed a vacation of some sort, and they gave not even the B team, they gave the D team because according to reports, these are just reports, Jill Biden, who's the president's wife, was campaigning in Pennsylvania as well. And, she got some of those 18 folks. She is the wife of the president, not a political figure, really. And the guy who's the one you would think would have a shot at after the president would be Trump. And that was who didn't have, shall we say, the best of protection, it appears, right now. So, they have a lot of work to do in the administration to get this stuff under control.
Yeah, I mean, deeply shocking that it would be politicized in that way. Okay, so we've spoken about the public's reaction. Let's talk briefly about the media reaction. So I was watching it as well, live, and one of the interesting things was flicking over to CNN and seeing how they were covering it. And one of the early headlines was, and I quote here, "Secret Service rushes Trump off stage after he falls at rally." And MSNBC had to cancel their show Morning Joe because they thought too many of their guests might have made crass comments about the president who just had an attempt on his life. So what have you made of the media reaction to this?
Well, the media, and by that I mean mostly the mainstream media, the major broadcast networks, the major newspapers, have all become agenda-driven vehicles in the last 20 years. It's because the Democrat establishment has become bigger, they've taken over the government, and everybody, is trying to get along, shall we say. So the media can't change their spots overnight because, they're a presidential candidate gets shot, all right? So they reacted as you might think they did. First off, they minimized the shooting because they know that the more you go on about that, Trump, assassination attempt, the more you will stoke up sympathy for him, as it should be. So they tried to play that down initially, and it was disgraceful. And you've mentioned just one example. My favorite one was the Denver Post on Sunday. Their headline on the assassination was "Gunman dies in attack." Didn't even mention Trump's name. It's like, come on, guys, come on. So, and I like you, I saw CNN and MSNBC because they're my favorite entertainment at the moment. And I will say something about CNN. They had Steve Scalise on, and Steve Scalise, a representative who was shot in 2017 by and this was caused by Democrat. He was a Democrat activist, and he shot up Republicans on a baseball field, and Scalise managed to survive. And it was because at the time there was tensions running high with Trump, being elected president. So they had him on, and they said, "Well, shouldn't you be responsible for bringing the temperature down?" Just like we were talking about earlier. And he was very nice. You've got to be a politician. You go, "Oh yeah." But as soon as I saw that, I'm starting again thinking, how dare you? The guy was shot, and you're asking him to turn the temperature down. So the media actors, I thought they would. They're still in shock because of the debate, and they don't know how to react. They don't know whether to support Biden or support somebody else, or they're all running around like chickens with their heads cut off. But reflexively, they knew what to do in this case, which is to minimize Trump and try and control it that way. And that's very, very annoying, and people notice it. It adds to the seething outrage underneath that I mentioned before. In terms of politicians. I'll give you one example. Biden. He went on TV, the Oval Office, and said, very solemnly, we've got to turn down the temperature, as if, again, both sides both sides were responsible for this. And this is someone whose account, whose Twitter X account, over the last few years has gone on and on and on about Trump being the biggest danger to the country, the danger to democracy. He has to be stopped. The biggest threat to us. On and on and on about it. I collected a few just to check out that I hadn't been, sort of was misinformed. But there they are, and it's not Biden putting that in; it's his team, right? Because I don't know if Biden knows knows what day it is at the moment. But then he went on and read a speech in which it was all again: turn the temperature down, both sides, unity. Sorry, mate, too late. You had 4 years to do that, and you turned the temperature up to 500 degrees. So we're not going to listen to that anymore. And that's not just, I'm more of I'm a Republican elected official. I'm more of more conservative. But you're going to find that the election result has already been decided, in my view. I think it was already decided after the debate, because even Democrats had to say, "Oh, yeah." Actually, I know a lot of Democrats, and they had to say, "Well, look, yeah, okay, we understand. Well, maybe he's not well." But that heroic picture, the image of Trump as a leader, if you like, that's going to resonate too. And I think what happened was. I don't know if talking about football, when England won the World Cup, there was a great commentator who said at the very end of the game, they think it's all over. And then it wasn't. Jeff Hurst scored the goal in the last second. And then he said, it is now. Okay, well, after the debate, all right. Okay, you may as well change that to, they think it's Joe over. It is now. Because that after the debate, okay, I think Joe's over. But with that assassination attempt, it underlines it, says it is now. And that's what I think the election will be. There's 3 months to go, obviously. It's a ways off. But I think certain indelible things happened over the last 2 weeks that cannot be wished, down the memory hole. They're going to be there. They're going to resonate with people.
Absolutely. Tony Morrison, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
No, thank you, Laurie. I appreciate it.
Now, when the landmark Cass review into NHS gender medicine was published earlier this year, it confirmed what campaigners had been saying for many years, that the model of so-called gender-affirming care used at the London Tavistock Clinic, where minors presenting with gender distress were prescribed puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and often so-called gender reassignment surgery, was unsafe, unevidenced, and was doing irreversible harm to highly vulnerable children. So what has been the response? Well, to talk about that, I'm very pleased now to be joined by one of those campaigners, Dr. Carole Sherwood, who is a clinical psychologist and the founder of Save Mental Health. Welcome to The Sceptic, Carole.
Okay. Hello, Laurie. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I'm really grateful to you.
Now, the Cass review did seem to be a watershed moment when it comes to this issue. Both major parties endorsed it. The NHS said it would implement its recommendations. And suddenly, in the wake of it, you could go on the mainstream media and talk about the problems with gender-affirming care and not be called a transphobe. But of course, over the years, there have been a lot of people who've been very zealously committed to this so-called gender-affirming model. So how is the medical establishment taking the Cass review 3 months on from its being published?
Yeah, that's a very good summary of the situation, Laurie. I think the medical establishment, as you just explained, in the form of NHS England, have responded very well and decisively by banning puberty blockers for children and also deciding they were going to provide special services that will be nationwide for children and young people who are questioning their gender identity. And also just acknowledging that we're not just talking about children and young people here. There are a lot of young adults, sort of 17 to 25-year-olds, who are also in need of specialist care, evidence-based care. And so NHS England, I think, have actually undertaken to carry out their own review of those services. So the medical establishment, I think, have responded well. The problem comes with the professional therapeutic bodies who seem to have a rather more ambivalent reaction to the CAS review. And if I may, I can give you 2 examples of this. There is a third, but we probably will come on to this a little later. So the 2 main therapeutic bodies that we have here in the UK are the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. That's the BACP. A lot of acronyms here, okay? Now, the BACP have not responded at all to the CAS review. I mean, we're 3 months on and there's nothing. And they continue to promote gender-affirming care and gender identity ideology. One of their members actually wrote to a senior person at the BACP and said, why is this? Well, why are you not even acknowledging CAS and the recommendations? And she got the reply that, well, the findings of the CAS review were primarily about medical pathways and interventions, and our members have no role in either. And this is simply not true. What CAS was saying is that, the first line of intervention has to be psychological, psychotherapeutic, intervention and support. So it's curious to me as to why they might take that stance, because it actually leaves their members in a very vulnerable position. Because, do they follow the recommendations of the CAS review or not? Or do they get into trouble if they do with their governing body? It's a problem. So we have the main psychotherapeutic body and counselling body being, well, nothing to see here about the CAS review. And then we have the main psychological body, the British Psychological Society, that's the BPS, who are giving us mixed messages. On the one hand, on the day that the CAS review, the final report landed, we had the president-elect of the BPS praising it, commending it, saying that, this is really important, and what Dr. Cass has to say about bullying clinicians, this has to stop. We completely agree. Very good, strong message. But on the same day, we had their chair, this is the BPS chair of sexualities, this is a prominent position that this man holds, saying on his LinkedIn account, this is a bad day for trans youth. So we have a very strange mixed message. And the BPS spokesperson responded to this by saying, oh, yes, but we've got 60,000 members. Of course, we're going to have disagreements. But this is a man who is chair of the BPS sexualities. This is the man that would be responsible for bringing about the changes, the recommendations that Cass makes in her review. So it isn't a minor matter. This is a serious concern. And if I may just tell you a little bit more about the BPS, Laurie, it's okay. They are also responsible for producing guidelines for psychologists on working with gender, sexuality, and diverse relationships. Now, these guidelines were criticised when I think there was a version that came out, was it 2018 or 2019, which was criticised for being ideologically driven. It promoted the gender-affirming model, and it referred to things like you must reclaim the word slut. So if somebody comes to your consulting room and says they're a slut, you mustn't question it. Now, that is completely unethical and not therapeutic. These guidelines were, after the Cass review, I think in June, they were updated. And although gender-affirming care has been removed and references to reclaimed language like slut have been removed, they are still ideologically driven, and they still claim that the source of people who are gender questioning, the source of their distress is in stigma and society. This is a problem. So the working group on these guidelines is actually, if you look at it, all of them are gender ideologues, without exception. So we still have a situation, I think the BPS is in an impossible situation, because on the one hand, their chairman is saying, yes, we must support the Cass review and we must move forward with the Cass review recommendations. And on the other, they've got a lot of prominent clinicians who advocate gender identity ideology and indeed are members of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which was recently discredited by Mia Hughes and the WPATH files. So how they're in a bind. It's really difficult to see how they get out of this. So in terms of the medical establishment, seems to be going well, good, very decisive responses. But in terms of the professional therapeutic organisations, we have a problem.
Okay, so just to remind ourselves why we're talking about psychology and psychotherapy here, patients undergoing gender transition are given hormones and potentially surgery, which are obviously medical interventions. But really the underlying problem here is a mental illness, namely gender dysphoria. Now, you're trained as a clinical psychologist. Can you just tell us a bit more about the mental health side of this issue?
Yes, the problem, Laurie, is that, as this was exposed actually in Hannah Barnes' excellent book, Time to Think, is that children who were presenting to the Tavistock Gender Identity Services Clinic were presenting actually with a range of different psychological problems. They would be gender questioning, but in fact, I think it was 89% of these children were found to be same-sex attracted. And in addition to this, there were children with autism, who have particular needs that were not being taken into account. There are children who have experienced trauma. There are a lot of children, looked after children in this sort of group of people who experience problems with gender identity. And in the Tavistock GIDS clinic, this was not being acknowledged. And so there's a lot of unmet need. And what you would normally do in a psychological service for any other child and any other person is you would do a full exploratory assessment. This is good, well, it's standard ethical practice. You need to find out what are the factors that are contributing to this person's distress. That doesn't mean that you invalidate their distress or you don't affirm their distress, but you need to be curious about what else is going on. What are the other factors that might be playing into the distress? And this is good gold standard treatment, which Dr. Cass herself said this has not been happening in services like the Tavistock GIDS. The children have just been put straight on a medical pathway, or hormone pathway. And we need to actually reflect, step back from that and do a proper exploratory assessment to find out. A lot of these children will have other factors, other things that are contributing to their distress, which we need to find out and address. It may be that some of them really do want to go down the hormone and medical pathway, but you need to do a proper assessment. And this is not going to be done in a couple of sessions. This is long-term work. And that's why it's important.
Definitely. Okay, so there's this divide between the psychological side and the trans ideology side. I know you've written a bit about the sort of internecine warfare between these sides in these organisations. Can you just tell us a bit more about that battle and who's winning?
Yes, I think Dr. Anna Hutchison put it very well in her article, which I actually quoted in mine. And the nub of it is that this kind of exploratory approach, which, as I said, is mainstream, there's nothing new in this. This is what you do if you are an ethical practicing clinician, is viewed by activists, and I'm just going to quote her here. She says that some activists argue that anything other than self-diagnosis and the provision of gender-affirming care, including medical affirmation for children and young people, is a type of conversion therapy that should be banned. So what we have, and again, I do talk about this in the article, is the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy. Now, this is a policy document that was created, I think it was about 2015. It followed an example of actual conversion therapy that was being conducted with somebody with same-sex orientation. And so I think the psychological bodies, the psychotherapeutic and psychological bodies, felt that they had to do something about this. This was actually quite shocking. And so the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy was drawn up, 2015, same-sex only. It's gone through several versions since then. So in 2017, it was extended to gender identity. Even though gender identity is a belief, it's not based in biology. And then in 2022, most controversially, it was extended to children. But this was not announced. It was not made clear. And children and young people have very different needs developmentally to adults. And this is why, and we come to the next psychotherapeutic body that plays a part in this, the UK Counselling and Psychotherapy Council, the UKCP, when they discovered that this was the case, that the MOU, as it is known, was actually referring to children as well as adults, they withdrew from it. Because they wanted to make it clear that they were going to protect and safeguard children and young people. They were concerned about the welfare and safety of young people. And by doing that, they incurred the wrath of a group of activist therapists who call themselves Therapists Against Conversion Therapy and Transphobia, or TACT, who were outraged by this and actually drew up a petition to try and call for a vote of no confidence in the Board of Trustees of the UKCP. And they succeeded in implementing a vote of no confidence. Fortunately, just only last week, I think, or actually it was the beginning of this week, they failed. There was a decisive vote to support the board. But this is a situation we find ourselves in, Laurie, where activists are wielding a lot of power. They are bullying these organisations. They're bullying therapists who are trying to implement the CAS review recommendations. They're bullying the organisations to set standards like the guidelines I've just told you about with the BPS. And unless something is done about the Memorandum of Understanding, which is signed by many organisations, so NHS England is one of them, the Royal College of Psychiatrists is another, all the psychological organisations, charities like Relate, until people take a stand and say, no, we can't do this because we have to put the safeguarding of children first. We have to rethink this. Until that is done, this problem is going to continue. And there is a link, as I'm sure we'll go to talk about, with the government.
Yes, and obviously one thing that really influences this battle is the wider political conversation. And we now have as Prime Minister a man who once said that it's not right to say that only women have a cervix, and who also said that 1 in 1,000 women has a penis. So how will having a Labour government influence the wider trans culture war?
Sure. I mean, I think the first point I'd like to make, Laurie, is that I don't think the Conservatives were particularly good on this, with some very notable exceptions. Kemi Badenoch in particular, Miriam Cates, in terms of, campaigning around schools. They've allowed this to happen. This has happened on their watch. And, the Labour Party are just picking it up and perhaps actually making things worse. I think what has really troubled me, Laurie, in the last week or so, is Keir Starmer calling for an end to what he calls a divisive culture war over trans rights. And recently, Lisa Nandy, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, has said the era of the culture wars is over. Now, to me, that sounds rather like the no debate stance, which is taken by trans activists. We're not allowed to actually speak about this, but there has to be some discussion about this, because a trans inclusive ban on conversion therapy is not, I would argue, compatible with the recommendations of the CAS review. Because the way that the Memorandum of Understanding is structured, which is definitely informing this, and I can explain why in a moment, it's very hard to argue for an exploratory approach. The Memorandum of Understanding allows for a certain amount of exploration if somebody's presenting with uncertainty about their gender identity, but a lot of young people are very certain that they're born in the wrong body. And in those cases, you wouldn't be allowed, you would be, it would be unlawful to actually have that conversation with young people. So it's completely at odds with the Cass Review. And we've got people like Wes Streeting saying, well, we must, we've got to honour the Cass Review, we've got to carry out its recommendations. And then you've got others like Keir Starmer, Lisa Nandy, and the two women equalities ministers, sort of arguing for the kind of trans point of view without actually taking into account both the Cass Review recommendations and women's rights.
Okay, well, Dr. Carole Sherwood, thanks very much for coming on.
You're very welcome, Laurie. Thank you for inviting me.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.